March 14, 1943, Hickam Field, Hawaii. The air smelled of engine oil and salt water, the kind of mixture that sticks to your lungs and won't leave for days. Lieutenant James Jimmy Caldwell stood at the edge of the tarmac, watching P-38 Lightnings taxi into formation under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. He was 21 years old, barely, and every officer above the rank of captain had told him the same thing. Too young, too green, too eager. They said he should fly cargo runs, maybe reconnaissance if he proved himself. They said the Pacific was no place for boys who'd earned their wings 6 months ago, but wars don't wait for men to grow old. Jimmy had logged more simulator hours than half the squadron combined, had dissected every aircraft manual like scripture, and possessed something the older pilots had lost somewhere between Pearl Harbor and Midway, the absolute, unshakable belief that he could do what needed doing. The base commander had signed his transfer orders with a grimace. "Don't make me regret this, Lieutenant." Jimmy saluted and said nothing. Words were cheap. The sky would tell the truth. The Pacific Theater in early 1943 was a graveyard of assumptions. American forces had stopped the Japanese advance at Midway, but holding ground and taking it back were different wars entirely. The logistics were staggering. Fuel, ammunition, replacement parts, fresh pilots, all had to be ferried across thousands of miles of open ocean to islands with names most Americans couldn't pronounce. Every sortie was a calculus of range, payload, and the ever-present knowledge that a single mechanical failure meant death by drowning or capture. Jimmy's squadron, the 475th Fighter Group, nicknamed the Satan's Angels, was stationed at Port Moresby, New Guinea, a hellish strip of mud and mosquitoes where the air itself seemed to rot. The airfield was carved from jungle. Maintenance crews worked under camouflage netting while Japanese bombers prowled overhead. Morale was a fragile thing, held together by mail from home and the dark humor men use when they know the odds. The older pilots tolerated Jimmy with the bemused patience reserved for mascots. Captain Frank Delaney, a veteran of the Aleutians campaign with 12 kills to his name, called him the Kid and made sure everyone knew it. "He's got the eyes of a hawk and the sense of a puppy," Delaney said one night in the officer's tent, shuffling a worn deck of cards. "Give him a month. Either he'll figure it out or we'll be shipping him home in a box." Jimmy said nothing. He spent his evenings studying reconnaissance photos, memorizing Japanese formations, learning the flight characteristics of the Zero from captured manuals. He knew what they thought of him. Every sidelong glance, every patronizing smile. He'd heard it all before. In flight school, where instructors treated him like a prodigy or a liability depending on the day. In his hometown of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, where neighbors clucked their tongues and told his mother he was throwing his life away. But Jimmy had learned something those men hadn't. Doubt was a luxury. You couldn't afford it at 20,000 feet with a zero on your tail. You either trusted your instincts and your training, or you hesitated, and hesitation killed you faster than any bullet. So he waited, and he watched, and he prepared. The war would give him his chance. It always did. The chance came on a Tuesday morning in April, under a sky streaked with high cirrus clouds that looked like brushstrokes on canvas. Intelligence had spotted a Japanese convoy moving south through the Bismarck Sea. Troop transports, destroyers, possibly a light cruiser. The mission was simple in theory: intercept, strafe, and return before the escort fighters could regroup. 12 P-38s would go. Jimmy was number 11. The briefing room smelled of sweat and stale coffee. The squadron commander, Major William Wild Bill Harris, traced the route on a map with a wooden pointer. "We hit them at dawn. Low approach, tight formation. Delaney leads the first element, I'll take the second. Questions?" Jimmy raised his hand. "Sir, if we come in low, we're sitting ducks for the destroyer's AA guns. What if we split, half high, half low, draw their fire, then dive?" The room went quiet. Delaney turned slowly, his expression hovering between annoyance and disbelief. "Kid, we've been doing this since before you could shave. We know what works." But Major Harris studied the map, his jaw working. "It's not a bad idea. Unorthodox, but not bad." He looked at Jimmy. "You volunteer to be in the high element?" "Yes, sir." "Then you've got it. Don't make me regret listening to a 21-year-old. The mission launched at 0500 hours. Jimmy's P-38 felt like an extension of his body. Every vibration, every shift in airspeed, every subtle change in engine tone registered in his bones. They flew in radio silence, skimming the wave tops to avoid radar. The ocean below was the color of gunmetal, endless and indifferent. Then they saw the convoy. 6 transports in a loose column, flanked by destroyers bristling with anti-aircraft guns. Delaney's element dove first, tracers arcing up like angry fireflies. Jimmy pulled back on the stick, climbing hard, sunlight flashing off his canopy. At 8,000 feet he rolled inverted and dove, screaming down through the flak, his finger on the trigger. He didn't think. Thinking was the enemy. He simply flew, adjusting, compensating, predicting. His guns raked a destroyer's superstructure, and he pulled up so hard he grayed out for a second, vision narrowing to a tunnel. When it cleared, he was alive. 3 planes weren't. They made it back to Port Moresby with half their ammunition gone and 2 aircraft streaming fuel. Jimmy's hands didn't shake until he climbed out of the cockpit. Then they trembled so badly he couldn't light his cigarette. A mechanic did it for him, grinning. "Hell of a first run, Lieutenant." Captain Delaney found him an hour later, sitting on an empty fuel drum and staring at nothing. The older pilot dropped down beside him, pulling a flask from his jacket. "Drink." Jimmy did. It burned. "You did good up there," Delaney said. "Stupid, but good. That dive, you could have torn the wings off. I calculated the G-load, sir. The airframe could handle it." Delaney laughed. A short bark of sound. "Jesus Christ, you calculated it. You really are a different breed, aren't you?" He took the flask back, drank, and wiped his mouth. "Listen, kid. You've got talent. Real talent. But talent gets you killed if you think it makes you invincible. You understand me?" "Yes, sir." "No, you don't. Not yet." Delaney stood, stretching his back. "But you will. This war's got a way of teaching lessons whether you want them or not." That night, Jimmy couldn't sleep. He lay on his cot in the sweltering tent, listening to the chorus of insects and distant thunder, and replayed the mission in his mind. He'd done everything right. Mostly. But he'd also felt something during that dive. Something he didn't have words for yet. A kind of clarity. A sense of rightness, as if the world had narrowed to a single bright point, and everything else had fallen away. He'd heard older pilots talk about it. The flow state where instinct and training fused into something greater than the sum of its parts. Some men never found it. Some found it and lost it. Jimmy had found it at 21, and he knew with a certainty that bordered on the mystical, that he would find it again. The war had tested him. He had not failed. But the real test, he sensed, was still coming. The missions would get harder, the stakes higher, the losses more personal. And when that moment arrived, he would either prove himself or be broken by it. There was no middle ground. Not in war. Not in the sky. In the weeks that followed, Jimmy flew 23 combat sorties. He learned the rhythm of war, the adrenaline spike of takeoff, the grinding tension of patrol, the explosive chaos of contact, and the hollow exhaustion of return. He learned that men processed fear differently, some through bravado, some through silence, some through meticulous ritual. He learned that luck mattered as much as skill, and that good men died for reasons that made no sense. He also learned that the squadron was watching him. It started subtly. Delaney stopped calling him Kid and started calling him Caldwell. Major Harris assigned him to lead a 2-plane element on a reconnaissance run. The mechanics began asking his opinion on engine performance. In the mess tent, pilots made room for him at their table without being asked. But respect in a fighter squadron is a double-edged blade. It meant they trusted him, but it also meant they expected more. When Lieutenant Bobby Hernandez's P-38 took a 20mm shell through the cockpit and spiraled into the jungle, Jimmy was the one who had to write the letter to his widow. When intelligence reported a new Japanese airbase being constructed at Wewak, Jimmy was the one Harris pulled aside and said, "I need someone to lead a strike. You up for it?" He was 21 years old. Bobby Hernandez had been 23. "Yes, sir," Jimmy said. The strike on Wewak was the kind of mission that looked simple on paper and turned into a nightmare in practice. 40 fighters, P-38s and Australian Kitty Hawks, against an airfield defended by AA batteries, revetments, and an unknown number of Zeros. They would go in at dawn, hit the parked aircraft, and extract before reinforcements arrived. Clean. Surgical. Except nothing in war was ever clean. Jimmy spent 2 days planning, poring over maps and weather reports, calculating fuel loads and attack angles. He barely slept. He dreamed of his father, a crop duster pilot who died in a crash when Jimmy was 12. In the dream, his father looked at him with sad, knowing eyes and said, "Flying's easy, son. It's the landing that kills you." When Jimmy woke, his pillow was soaked with sweat. He dressed in the dark, checked his sidearm, and walked to the airfield. The first light of dawn was just touching the horizon. In 6 hours, he would either be a hero or a cautioned tale. The Wewak strike launched at 0530 hours, under a sky the color of bruised plums. 40 aircraft, an armada by Pacific Theater standards, formed up over the Coral Sea and turned northwest. Jimmy flew lead. His wingman, a taciturn Texan named Dale Whitmore, who chewed tobacco in the cockpit and spat into a tin can. Radio chatter was minimal. The plan was simple. Come in low over the water, climb at the last second, and hit the airfield in 3 waves. Jimmy's element would target the fuel depot, the second would strafe the runway, the third would engage any fighters that got airborne. In and out, 15 minutes maximum. Any longer and they'd be fighting on fumes. But intelligence was always incomplete, and war had a way of punishing assumptions. As they crossed the coastline, dense jungle giving way to the grid of the airfield, the sky erupted. Anti-aircraft fire came up in sheets, black puffs blooming like evil flowers. Jimmy's headset crackled with shouts. "Break left! I'm hit! Where the hell did those come from?" He didn't have time to think. Training took over. He nosed down, bleeding speed, and skimmed the treetops at 300 miles per hour. His gun sight found the fuel depot, a cluster of drums and tanker trucks, and he fired. The P-38 shuddered with recoil. Behind him, the depot erupted in a gout of orange flame that climbed into the sky like a living thing. But then Whitmore's voice, tight and urgent. "Zeros! High 2 o'clock!" Jimmy looked up and saw them. 6 fighters diving out of the sun, the classic attack position. They must have been on patrol, circling high enough to avoid detection. Now they were coming down like hawks, and Jimmy's element was exposed, low and slow after the strafing run. He had perhaps 3 seconds to decide. Run for the coast and risk being chased down. Turn and fight and risk running out of fuel before they made it home. Or, all aircraft, this is lead. Climb and engage. Stick with your wingman. Do not, repeat, do not, chase singles. We fight as a unit, or we die as individuals. The P-38 leaped upward, engines screaming. The sky became a tangle of metal and physics, and Jimmy felt that clarity again. That bright, hard-edged focus where everything else fell away, and only the moment existed. The dogfight lasted 7 minutes. It felt like 7 hours. Zeros were nimble, agile, deadly in the hands of experienced pilots. But P-38s were fast, heavily armed, and rugged. Jimmy used altitude and teamwork, coordinating with Whitmore in clipped radio calls. "Break right. On your 6. I've got him." They fought not as individuals, but as a pair, covering each other's blind spots, setting up shots, denying the Zeros the turning fights they excelled at. Jimmy got a kill, his first confirmed. The Zero came apart in midair, pieces tumbling earthward like confetti. He didn't feel triumph. He felt nothing at all, just the cold logic of survival. There was no room for anything else. Then Whitmore's voice, strained. "I'm losing oil pressure. Engine 2's running hot. Damn. Can you make the coast?" "Maybe, if we leave now." Jimmy scanned the sky. The dogfight was fragmenting, aircraft scattering in all directions. Some of the squadron were already heading east, trailing smoke or limping on one engine. Others were still engaged, locked in desperate spirals. He could stay and help, risk Whitmore's life, risk his own. Or he could go, save his wingman, and live with the guilt of leaving men behind. It wasn't a fair choice. War never offered fair choices. "All aircraft, this is lead. Disengage and rally at Point Delta. I repeat, disengage." He rolled his P-38 east and opened the throttles. Whitmore fell in beside him, his damaged engine trailing a thin ribbon of smoke. They made it back. So did 31 others. 9 didn't. Jimmy climbed out of his aircraft and vomited onto the tarmac. Nobody said anything. A crew chief handed him a canteen. He rinsed his mouth, spat, and walked to the debriefing tent on legs that didn't quite feel like his own. Major Harris was waiting. He looked 10 years older than he had that morning. "Rough one." "Yes, sir. You made the right call. Pulling out, I mean." Jimmy said nothing. Right and wrong felt like words from a different language, a different world. 9 men were gone. He'd led them in. Some of them hadn't come back. That was the arithmetic. That was the truth. And no amount of rationalization would change it. "Get some rest, Caldwell," Harris said quietly. "You've earned it." But rest didn't come. Not that night. Not for a long time. Summer 1943 bled into fall. The squadron rotated back to Australia for rest and refit. 2 weeks in Brisbane where the beer was warm and the locals treated them like heroes or harbingers of doom. depending on their mood. Jimmy spent most of his time alone, walking the riverfront, watching the brown water slide past. He wrote letters home but didn't mail them. What could he say? I'm fine. The weather's nice. I killed a man today and didn't feel anything. When they returned to the front, it was to a new base at Dobadura, New Guinea, and a new mission, bomber escort. The B-24 Liberators were flying deep strikes into Rabaul, the Japanese stronghold at the northern tip of New Britain. It was a meat grinder. The bombers were slow, vulnerable, and the Japanese threw everything they had at them. Zeros, flak, even ramming attacks by pilots who'd run out of ammunition. The P-38's job was to keep them alive. It was like trying to protect a herd of elephants from a pack of wolves. Jimmy flew escort 17 times. He hated it, not because it was dangerous. Everything was dangerous, but because it was helpless. You couldn't attack. You couldn't maneuver freely. You had to stay with the bombers, absorb the pressure, and watch good men die because you couldn't be everywhere at once. In October, they lost 4 bombers on a single mission. Jimmy's flight shot down 6 Zeros, but it didn't matter. The bombers went down in flames and the P-38s limped home with empty ammunition bays and fury in their hearts. That night, Major Harris called him into his tent. The major looked like hell. Bloodshot eyes, 3 days of stubble, a tremor in his hands he couldn't quite hide. Caldwell, I'm recommending you for promotion, Captain, and I'm giving you command of A Flight. Jimmy stared. Sir, I'm not. You're not what? Old enough? Experienced enough? Harris laughed bitterly. Kid, half the squadron's dead or rotated home. You've got more combat time than anyone except me and Delaney. And Delaney's getting shipped stateside next month. So it's you or nobody. What if I say no? Then you're a smarter man than I am. Harris poured 2 glasses of whiskey, slid one across the desk. But you won't. Because you're like me. You can't walk away. Not while there's still a war to fight. Captain James Caldwell. It sounded absurd. He was 22 years old and responsible for 16 pilots, most of whom were older than him. Some resented the promotion. A few refused to acknowledge it. But most simply accepted it the way soldiers accept everything in war, with grim pragmatism and dark humor. Delaney, days away from his flight home, took Jimmy aside one evening. They sat on the wing of a parked P-38, watching the sun set over the jungle. You know what the difference is between a good leader and a dead one? Tell me. A good leader knows when to listen. A dead one thinks he knows everything. Delaney lit a cigarette, cupped the flame against the wind. You're smart, Caldwell. Maybe too smart, but intelligence won't keep your boys alive. Experience will, and you don't have enough of it yet. Then what do? You lean on the men who do. You ask questions. You admit when you're wrong. He blew smoke into the fading light. And you accept that some of them will die anyway and it won't be your fault. That's the hardest part. That's the part that'll break you if you let it. Jimmy wanted to argue, to insist he could handle it. But he'd learned enough to keep his mouth shut. Delaney had flown 80 combat missions. He'd earned the right to speak truth, no matter how bitter. By November, the war had shifted. American forces were pushing north, island by island, bloody mile by bloody mile. The Japanese were retreating, but retreat made them more dangerous, not less. Cornered animals fought hardest. The air battles grew fiercer, more desperate. Kamikaze attacks became common. Jimmy saw a Zero ram a B-24, both aircraft disintegrating in a ball of fire. He shot down his 10th enemy aircraft and felt nothing but weariness. He began to understand what Delaney had meant. This wasn't a test of courage or skill. It was a test of endurance, of how much a man could absorb before something inside him broke. Some men broke loudly, screaming or weeping or refusing to fly. Others broke quietly, becoming hollow-eyed and distant, going through the motions with mechanical precision. Jimmy didn't know which kind he'd be when his turn came. He only knew it was coming. The only question was when. December 1943. The squadron received orders for Operation Cartwheel, a coordinated offensive to neutralize Rabaul. It would be the largest air campaign in the Pacific to date. Hundreds of bombers, fighters, and reconnaissance aircraft striking simultaneously. Jimmy's flight was assigned to sweep ahead of the bomber stream, clearing the skies of Japanese interceptors. The briefing took place in a sweltering Quonset hut, maps pinned to every wall. Commanders from the Army, Navy, and Marines crowded around tables, their voices a cacophony of jargon and acronyms. Jimmy stood in the back, absorbing details, mentally cataloging threats and opportunities. The stakes were clear. Rabaul was the linchpin of Japanese defenses in the region. If it fell, The road to the Philippines and ultimately Japan would be open. But the fortress was defended by over 300 aircraft, dozens of anti-aircraft batteries, and some of the most experienced pilots in the Imperial Japanese Navy. Losses would be catastrophic. Jimmy's role was simple in theory: led 12 P-38s in a fighter sweep 30 minutes ahead of the main strike. Engage any enemy fighters. Draw them away from the bombers. Survive. In practice, it was a suicide mission dressed up in tactical language. He gathered his pilots that evening. They sat in a circle on the ground, cleaning weapons, writing letters, smoking. Jimmy didn't give them a pep talk. He gave them the truth. This is going to be bad. Worse than anything we've done. Some of us won't come back. I can't promise you glory or medals or anything except a fight. But I can promise you this. We go in together, we fight together, and we cover each other's backs. No heroics. No lone wolf bullshit. We're a unit. We act like one or we die like fools. Nobody spoke. Then a young lieutenant from Georgia, fresh out of flight school, raised his hand. Captain, you ever scared? Jimmy thought about lying, about projecting the confidence expected of a commander. Then he thought about Delaney's advice. Every single time, he said, fear keeps you sharp. It's not the fear that'll kill you. It's ignoring it. The lieutenant nodded slowly. Around the circle, Jimmy saw something shift. A subtle relaxation, a shared acknowledgement. They were all scared. They were all in this together. And somehow that made it bearable. The mission launched at dawn. The sky was empty and blue and infinite. They hit Rabaul at 6:15 hours, diving out of the sun with throttles firewalled. The harbor below was a forest of masts and smokestacks, destroyers, transports, repair ships. And above it, like a swarm of hornets, came the Zeros, 20 of them, maybe 30. Jimmy stopped counting. His headset exploded with voices. Bogey's 11 o'clock high. I'm on him. Break, break, break. The sky became a tumbling chaos of aircraft, tracers, and desperation. Jimmy shot down 2 Zeros in the first 90 seconds. Pure reflex and training. Then a third latched onto his tail and he dove hard, pulling so many Gs that his vision tunneled to a pinprick. The Zero stayed with him, relentless. Jimmy juked right, then left, then rolled inverted and pulled through, his airspeed bleeding into the red. The Zero overshot, and Jimmy's wingman, a quiet Oklahoman named Roy Simmons, blew it apart with a 3-second burst. Thanks, Roy. Don't mention it, boss. They climbed back into the fight. Jimmy's hands moved without thought, guiding the P-38 through impossible angles, threading gaps in the flak, firing in short, disciplined bursts. His ammunition counter ticked down, fuel gauge dropping, engine temp rising. He was operating on instinct and adrenaline somewhere beyond fear or thought. Then he saw it, a lone P-38 trailing smoke, 3 Zeros circling like sharks. The pilot's voice on the radio, young and panicked. I'm hit, somebody help. It was the lieutenant from Georgia, the one who'd asked if Jimmy got scared. Jimmy didn't hesitate. He rolled hard, diving toward the stricken aircraft, Roy on his wing. They came in fast and angry, guns blazing. 1 Zero exploded. Another peeled off, trailing fire. The third tried to run, but Roy chased it down and turned it into scrap. The Georgian made it to the coast, ditched in the shallows, and was picked up by a Navy PT boat. He'd live, maybe fly again, maybe not, but he'd live. When Jimmy landed back at Dobadura, his hands were shaking so badly he couldn't undo his harness. A crew chief had to help him. Hell of a fight, Captain. Jimmy nodded. He couldn't speak. His throat was raw from shouting, his body a mass of bruises from the G-forces. But he was alive. They were alive. And that was enough. Operation Cartwheel succeeded. Rabaul was neutralized, its airfields cratered, its defenses shattered. The cost was steep. 47 aircraft lost, over 100 men dead or missing. But the road north was open. Jimmy's A flight lost 3 pilots. He wrote the letters himself, by hand, in a tent that smelled of mildew and exhaustion. He told the families their sons had died bravely, that their sacrifice mattered, that they would be remembered. He didn't mention the screams over the radio, the aircraft spiraling into the sea, the hollow feeling in his chest that wouldn't go away. In January 1944, the squadron was rotated stateside for rest and reconstitution. Jimmy was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross and promoted to major. He was 22 years old, had flown 93 combat missions, and was credited with 14 confirmed kills. Newspapers called him a hero. The mayor of Cedar Rapids threw him a parade. He stood on a platform in the town square, waving to crowds he didn't recognize and felt like an imposter. These people saw a hero. He saw a man who'd survived while others hadn't, through a combination of skill, luck, and the willingness to make decisions that haunted him at night. His mother hugged him and cried. His little sister asked if he'd killed bad guys. His uncle, a veteran of the Great War, looked at him with knowing, sorrowful eyes and said, "You did good, son. Don't let them tell you otherwise." But Jimmy couldn't shake the feeling that he'd left something behind, some essential part of himself scattered across the Pacific in pieces too small to retrieve. He went through the motions, smiled for photos, gave speeches to war bond rallies, visited flight schools to inspire the next generation, and all the while, he felt like a ghost. In March, he received orders: return to the Pacific, take command of a new fighter group, prepare for the invasion of the Philippines. He should have been terrified. Instead, he felt relief, because at least in the sky, fighting for his life and the lives of his men, he knew who he was. On the ground, surrounded by parades and platitudes, he was lost. He kissed his mother goodbye, boarded a transport, and flew west into the war that had made him and broken him, and was the only place he felt real. October 1944. The Philippines. The largest naval battle in history was unfolding in Leyte Gulf, and the skies above were a hurricane of steel. Major James Caldwell led 48 P-38s in defense of the escort carriers, small, vulnerable ships that were the lifeline of the invasion. The Japanese had sent everything they had: battleships, cruisers, and waves upon waves of kamikaze aircraft flown by pilots who'd made peace with death. Jimmy had been in the air for 6 hours, his fuel gauge hovering near empty, his ammunition down to 100 rounds. He'd shot down 3 kamikazes and driven off a dozen more. His wingmen were scattered, his radio a chaos of desperate calls. Below, a carrier was burning, listing heavily, its deck a mass of twisted metal and flame. Then he saw it, a formation of 12 Betty bombers, low and fast, heading straight for the carrier group. If they got through, hundreds of sailors would die. He had 2 choices: turn back, land, refuel, let someone else handle it, or make one final run with whatever he had left. He thought about the lieutenant from Georgia pulled from the sea. He thought about Delaney's words: "Some of them will die anyway, and it won't be your fault." He thought about his father spinning into an Iowa cornfield, and the lesson hidden in that tragedy. Flying was easy. It was the landing that killed you. And then he stopped thinking. "All aircraft, this is lead. One more run, follow me in." He dove. 3 P-38s followed. Men as exhausted and battered as he was. Men who should have gone home. Men who stayed because that's what warriors do. They tore into the bomber formation like avenging angels. Jimmy's guns hammered, tearing wings from fuselages, turning engines into fire. A Betty exploded so close the shockwave flipped him inverted. He corrected, fired again, and watched another bomber disintegrate. When it was over, 6 Bettys were burning in the sea. The rest scattered, mission aborted. Jimmy turned for base, his engine coughing, his fuel warning lights screaming red. He didn't know if he'd make it. He didn't care. He'd done what he came to do. The rest was up to physics and providence. He landed on fumes, the P-38 rolling to a stop 10 feet from the end of the runway. When he climbed out, he collapsed. They carried him to the hospital tent. He was asleep before they laid him down. The war ended in August 1945. Major James Caldwell was 23 years old, had flown 147 combat missions, and was credited with 21 confirmed kills and 13 probables. He'd been shot down once, wounded twice, and decorated by 3 governments. When the surrender was signed aboard the USS Missouri, he stood on the deck with thousands of other servicemen and felt nothing. No triumph, no relief, just a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. He returned to Cedar Rapids, married a schoolteacher named Ruth, and never flew again. He took a job at a tractor factory, bought a small house on the edge of town, and had 3 children. He didn't talk about the war. When people asked, and they did constantly, he deflected with humor or changed the subject. The medal sat in a drawer, wrapped in newspaper. It took him 20 years to understand what the war had taught him. It wasn't about heroism or glory or proving the doubters wrong. It was simpler and harder than that. Sometimes being young is an advantage. Youth is audacity. Youth is the willingness to try what experience says is impossible. They'd said he was too young to fly, but youth had given him the reflexes to survive, the imagination to innovate, and the fearlessness to lead when older men hesitated. He hadn't been fearless. Not really. But he'd learned to act despite the fear, and that made all the difference. In 1965, during the Vietnam War, a young pilot wrote to him asking for advice. Jimmy's reply was brief. Trust your training, trust your instincts, and never forget that the men beside you matter more than the mission. Take care of them and they'll take care of you. James Caldwell died in 1998, surrounded by family. His obituary in the Cedar Rapids Gazette ran 2 paragraphs and didn't mention the Distinguished Flying Cross. But the men who'd flown with him, the ones who survived, remembered. They remembered the young captain who'd been written off as too green, too eager, too young. They remembered the man who'd proven that age is just a number, and that courage has no birth date. They said he was too young to fly. He didn't argue, he just flew. And in flying he turned the tide.